By the late 90s, Linux was in full swing. Communities had sprouted up and new distributions were coming online seemingly every day. By this time, we had already seen some big names like Slackware and Debian emerge, and then others joined later, like Red Hat, Caldera, Mandrake, SUSE, and many others. Some are still here, and others have faded away. But soon another idea, unlike any other that had any modicum of success, would take shape. It all started on a server running a Pentium 166 on Debian. That would be 1.3, codename Bo, at the University of New Mexico. Daniel Robbins used this box to dive into Linux and learn as much as possible. Soon, he was installing Linux at home, too. And not just Debian, everything that was out there. Finally, just as with anybody trying all the Linux things, the dust settled, and Stampede Linux, a distribution briefly based on Slackware but independent shortly after, was the soft landing spot. It helped that Stampede used the PGCC compiler that was optimized for Pentium processors and gave a huge speed boost to the chip. But it was also an opportunity for Daniel to take this knowledge he'd been learning and put it to good use. For the betterment of his new favorite distribution, and more importantly, for the community around it. He'd benefited from the knowledge of those that knew more, turned around and used that knowledge to help others. And now it was time to give back to the developers too. He started work on SLP, the Stampede Linux package format, improved it and extended it to include many features in a version 6. While the head developers loved the work, others derided it. And that, the community aspect of development, led to Daniel's ultimate departure from the distribution. But without that derision, we wouldn't be where we are today. On the other side of all of that, Daniel continued to work on Stampede, but with a new goal in mind. Transform what he had into something totally new. Something performant and light, yes, but also something unlike distributions that were already out there. And at least at first, it all needed to be done alone. Automation was key, removing the repetitive tasks so focus can remain on the new and interesting bits. A name, meant to be temporary, was chosen for a big part of this automation. eBuild. It would patch, compile, and install. And soon enough, an entire system could be built using these scripts. When a system emerged, it was called Enoch. Through the flood of trials that presented themselves during this process, a renewed focus on submitting bugs upstream, especially to kernel developers, solidified. This distribution wouldn't let patches waste away in semi-hidden SRPMs or half-open repositories. Community really was the focus. After a little time, Enoch gave way to Gentoo. Chosen for the simple fact that the Gentoo penguin is the fastest swimming penguin there is. But more adversity struck before Gentoo could really get on its feet. A new box, equipped with a Celeron 366, overclocked of course, started running into issues in Linux when idle. Frequent lockups soured Daniel's perception of Linux, and he needed a break. And the BSD folk over at FreeBSD were doing a wonderful job of making an operating system. And wouldn't you know it, the idle bug didn't exist on that side of the fence. But BSD wasn't meant to be. But it wasn't all for nothing. Better documentation, a faster networking stack, and more importantly, the BSD ports trees, their way of compiling and installing software, really stuck. But BSD's lack of desktop focus, hardware support, and file system speeds enticed Daniel back over to the Linux side with a newer, less buggy development rig to use. And just in time for the Linux kernel 2.4 series, too. In late 2000, work on Gentoo ramped up. The eBuild system had taken in ideas from the BSD port system to become portage. And now It was full steam ahead to 1.0 with a release candidate 2, and sustainability of the project had made its way to the forefront. The Gentoo website throughout this time was changed up a little between 2000 and August 2001. Its final form, for a while, was reached on August 14th with the addition of proper written news instead of terse updates. By this time, the Gentoo 1.0 release had been in the works for over a year, with the 6th release candidate available at the end of the month. But it wouldn't be until March 3rd of 2002 that public-facing movement would easily spotted. It was the eBuilds freeze for the 1.0 release. Then, on the last day of March, 1.0 was finally released. And 8 days later, 1.1a followed it to continue the work and solidify the status of the project as a rolling release. In May, after news of the major release was flung far and wide, the huge influx of new users it encouraged caused bandwidth issues for Gentoo, and direct access to most things was revoked. Instead, users were instructed to the new DNS round-robin style load balancing to even things out. But this meant that people using the not too terribly old portage 1.8.8 and earlier needed to dig in and fix some things. Or, if you were lucky enough to have kept up and upgraded past that version, a simple configuration file change would do. Robin said of the issue,
"Of course, I'm very sorry for the sudden inconvenience. I hope you understand that Gentoo Linux's sudden growth has created its share of growing pains."
Another version, 1.2, was released in June with KDE 3 and GNOME 2 available in the portage tree. And while GNOME was essentially hidden because of its beta status, it could easily be enabled and installed, and was actually fairly stable overall. In September, the only gaming edition of Gentoo by the team themselves was released. It was a self-booting, NVIDIA-compatible live CD that came pre-packed with the first-person shooter, Unreal Tournament 2003. It was demoed at the Linux World Conference and Expo the next year. In August of 2003, the first official 1.4 was released, again at the Linux World Expo, and 300 Gentoo CDs of various architectures were handed out in the first few hours of the show. It also marked the release of the Gentoo reference platform. That was a default set of build instructions to get a Gentoo system up and running quickly. It was noted that a full installation, including x386, GNOME, KDE, and OpenOffice, could be compiled in under an hour. This release was quickly followed up by a maintenance release a month later. 2004 marked a change from the dot releases like 1.4 to a date-based versioning scheme that was planned to be quarterly, with the first release in January. But development does what development does, which led to February 28th as the release for 2004.0, and brought along with it the Catalyst project, which was meant to allow anybody to make reliable Gentoo versions and even fully booting live CDs. This release was revealed alongside the Gentoo store, where one could find pre-built live CDs and the Gentoo installation handbook on disk. A couple days before the next point release was to be announced on April 28th, Daniel Robbins, the creator and founder, resigns from Gentoo. But not before establishing the Gentoo Foundation, incorporated in New Mexico, which would inherit all properties and be allowed to represent Gentoo as a not-for-profit entity. He noted his departure was from burnout and the inability to focus on Gentoo development. 2004.1 was released shortly after that news. .2 in July, .3 in November, marking better compatibility, newer tools and eBuilds, and even more architectures. This would be the only time in Gentoo's history that 4 releases saw the light of day in a single year. 2005, and the next couple of years, was outwardly relatively quiet, but was still steadily gaining popularity as proven by mass forum registration, both legitimate signups and accounts used only to attack the forum itself in January. On March 27, 2005.0 released after a complete security rebuild. .1 followed in August with the code named El Nino. A media refresh was released in late November that would roll up the bug fixes since .1 that were too big to wait until next year's release. The first Gentoo Council was elected in September. 2006 saw 2 releases, one in February, .0, that could be grabbed as a live CD with a fully working GNOME environment built in, and one in August, .1, with newly separated desktop and server profiles from which to build a working system. After some time at Microsoft and other work, Daniel Robbins made his glorious return to the project. Not as a benevolent dictator for life this time, but as a contributor to the AMD 64 architecture team. This lasted about 8 days before he resigned again, citing interpersonal conflict with other members of the development team, much akin to his time at Stampede. Mostly blamed by those in the project on growing too fast, too quickly, the cracks began to show, and other developers joined Robbins in his departure for similar reasons. This, unfortunately, marked the Gentoo project as unstable for onlookers, and what was, up until that point, constant developer growth. Certainly, much more than any attrition the project was experiencing up until that point, took a large and marked downturn from which it never recovered. In the rest of 2007, there was only a single release, .0, in May, codenamed Secret Sauce. Much later in the year than planned, and was caused by a barrage of security bugs upstream that needed to be fixed or updated before release. It also included a completely new version of the Gentoo Linux installer on the live images. However, this year wasn't only marked by delays, but the Foundation suffered too, as some of the documentation required to remain in good standing as a not-for-profit never made it to the New Mexico authorities, which led to the Foundation falling into bad standing. Elections would soon be held for new trustees so that this issue wouldn't creep up again. The next year, in 2008, one final point release would be issued before a change. .0 in July, codenamed It's Got What Plants Crave. It included new profiles to base the system on and a move from GNOME to XFCE on the live media. A .1 was initially planned for later in the year, but September marked a big change in that regard. Donnie Burkholz noted,
Gentoo will focus on a more back-to-basics approach that will give you up-to-date install media on a regular basis and make much better use of our human resources. We're looking into automated weekly builds of the minimal CDs and staged tarballs, as well as maybe an annual live CD release.
In 2009, 2.5 releases were noted. 10.0, which was a departure from the year.release structure before, but no new work was done in August and October, a live DVD release followed. The release was mostly cosmetic, and users didn't need to do much. The number 10 in the version marked the 10th anniversary of Gentoo. A few days later, on October 10th, 10.1 was released as a bug fix release for the previous live media. There were no new releases in 2010, but this was just as well, since it allowed year-type versioning to resume, but without the 20 in front. This didn't mean that development stopped, just that the newest hardware would require bootstrapping with other types of media. 11.0, released in 2011, became the only release for the year on April 8th, 2011. While development seemed to stall in 2008, this year marked the end of the Gentoo reference platform, as it no longer showed up in later Gentoo handbooks. 2012 saw 3 releases. A new live DVD released at the very beginning of the year marked 12.0, and 12.1, which was released on April 1st with an install wizard webcam joke embedded into the live DVD when the date is or is set to April 1st. And a final release at the end of December named Gentoo Linux End of World Edition. The final two were certainly real releases, but with a silly twist. 2013 saw the deprecation of the 10.0 profiles and migrated to new 13.0 profiles for various architectures and required a little fiddling to upgrade. No new live media was minted. 2014, on the other hand, did see a new live DVD named the Iron Penguin Edition in August. In 2015, another joke to add to the pile. A new website was announced. It was billed as a more inclusive website than the previous and sported a whopping 16 total colors and was best viewed at the resolution of 640 by 200 in 2015. What an improvement. After the air was cleared, an actual new website was unveiled and it lives on in the same form today. In 2016, 2 live DVD-backed editions of Gentoo were released. In May, there was Gentoo Choice Edition. And while, yes, you had many choices, this choice was synonymous with best. Then in July, Choice Edition Part 2. In July of 2017, the Gentoo folks released a joke announcement referencing a Weird Al Yankovic song, Word Crimes.
This is a public service announcement to remind our community to be on the alert for word crimes. We hate to see words abused in terrible ways in our documentation, but you can help. You can stop this abuse. If you see a word crime, be sure to make things right. Simply perform the following steps. 1. Log in. 2. Click Edit. 3. Stop the crime from happening. 4. Click Save Page. Stay vigilant and have a great summer.
This was followed up by a pair of profile updates, 17.0 in November, that required manual intervention in the weeks after the project moved to GCC 6, and an experimental 17.1 in December, to facilitate both 32 and 64-bit libraries in 64-bit systems. 2018 saw no releases, but the developers did experience an issue on GitHub where code was mirrored. An attacker was able to get access to the repository by means of password guessing. It was reported that nothing else related to Gentoo was compromised and things were back to normal in about 5 days. 2019 saw the 17.1 profiles finally stabilize and upgrade was encouraged. In 2021, the addition of 20 dot profiles were released for the RISC-V architecture, and a non-news yet still in the profile list 22.0 profile for Long Arch sometime later. The latter two would only be temporary. While all the real moving and shaking was happening, mostly in the Gentoo news articles, one last practical joke was pulled on April 1st, 2021. Gentoo wasn't Gentoo anymore. It was Gentoo, a kawaii little mouse.
After many years, it's time for a radical overhaul. So here we present our new brand. Gentoo Linux becomes Gentoo Linux. Gentoo is also our new mascot. As you can see in the very kawaii graphics, definitely a big improvement over our boring old stylized letter. New artwork is still under construction, but we already have lots of wallpapers available for enthusiastic fans. Enjoy!
At the end of 2023, a late Christmas present for those of us with less than 32 cores. Precompiled binaries for more packages were announced. And in March of 2024, new profiles, after years of subtle and behind-the-scenes upgrades, are finally released. Profile version 23.0. Now, the future isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Unfortunately, Mikhail Gurny notes in his blog a few days before recording here that Gentoo has a problem, one that many other distributions and projects face. One of developer burnout, bit rot, and a stale number of new developers onboarding. But that doesn't mean Gentoo is gone. Gentoo is still forging ahead. And as I look behind me, Gentoo is still running.
Same here. You can catch all the great topics as they unfold on our Lemmy subreddit or our news channel on Discord. Those are all, linuxuserspace.show/Lemmy, Reddit, Discord, Mastodon, Telegram, Matrix, Twitch, Twitter. We've got it all. We're everywhere. We cover it all. So if you want to give us some feedback, catch the topics, you can do that in those places. Join the conversation, stay in touch with the news as it happens and unfolds.
Especially because there's going to be a little bit of a break for a little bit. So if you want to know how the show is going to be shaping up for the next season,
if that happens,
yeah, it would be a good idea to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah, and you can communicate with us real time in a lot of those places and tell us what you want to see and what you're hearing in the Linux verse.